right. So it's 11:03. So I think we can go ahead and get started, and then those that are unable to be here right now can join as the webinar's going through, and there'll be recordings for them. So I just want to kick off with a little bit of housekeeping for everyone. First and foremost, I want to thank and welcome everyone to our first official webinar of 2023. This one is hosted by our newsletter subgroup, so the credit goes to them, specifically Tanya and Jimena, who helped with organizing the presenters, and Jeff, who's kindly moderating the webinar for us. So welcome to Rising from the Ashes. Can the voluntary carbon market recover from the Verra controversy? Quick housekeeping, we'll ask everyone who's not a panelist to stay muted so we don't have any background noise during the webinar. If you do have any technical questions or need technical assistance, please reach out to me or Brandon. You'll see the Kinship Foundation behind our name, so just chat directly to us. We'll be happy to assist you. And then we will be recording the webinar, so anyone who has to leave or joins late, they'll be able to catch the recording to make up for what they missed. And then with that, I'll turn it over to Jeff.
All right, great. Thanks, Gladys. Really appreciate that introduction. So we aren't going to spend the normal 20 minutes of going through everyone's bios because everyone is well accomplished and we don't want to spend too much time, but I do want to let everybody have a little bit of an introduction before we get going. So Jeff Berckes, I know nothing about carbon beyond where it's at on the periodic table. And so I'm going to ask some maybe silly questions to make sure that I understand better as we go along. But I have three experts here that are going to get us going. So Ricardo, Bayon, can you introduce yourself really quickly?
Yeah, thanks, Jeff. So I'm a partner and founder at a group called Encourage Capital. We're an impact investment firm. We had a carbon fund until 2020. It was a 10-year fund, so we started in 2010. Before that, I wrote a book on the voluntary carbon markets way back in 2005, so the Middle Ages. Yeah, I don't think I even know where carbon is on the periodic table, so I'll leave it there.
I need to get a signed copy of that book. So Ceci, Simon, can you please introduce yourself as well?
Yeah, sure. I've also been in this space for quite a bit of time. I don't want to say when I started, but I've been working more on the certification side of things. So I work with the Climate Action Reserve and with Verra. So, and more recently with a couple of project developers. So I'm very excited about this conversation. And I also don't remember where carbon is on the periodic table. Now I'm going to have to go look it up.
Oh, see, I took a lot of chemistry in college, so I guess I got one up on you guys. And then finally, Elisa López García.
Hello, everyone. Thank you, Jeff. Excited to be here. So I am 2017 cohort. Hello, everyone. So I work as a blue carbon manager in the project development unit of climate consultancy and working in this side of things for a while. So I am an oceanographer, so I'm kind of into the marine and coastal ecosystem and getting into carbon, I guess, by chance, but really happy to provide the blue side of things in the conversation, I guess.
It's great. So we have a pretty good perspective, someone who's been in the markets a long time, someone who understands the standards, someone who understands project development, right? So we'll get into that and kind of get your different angles and slices into this as we work through. I want to kick off, though, by plugging that there is a carbon affinity group with Kinship. And so if you're interested in that, please reach out to the foundation and we'll get you plugged in and you guys can talk all the carbon stuff that you want. And we can get maybe some cool projects going and maybe work on some things that we talk about today. So I want to start off by having Ricardo, who wrote the book. Can you level set with us? So what are these markets for and are they accomplishing what they set out to do?
Yeah, I think in many ways they are. So are the markets perfect? Absolutely not. Can they be criticized? Absolutely. I think we are going through the most recent evolution of the carbon markets. Maybe we can call this carbon markets 6.0 or 7.0. And we've seen the ups and downs of this market many, many times in the past. And every time there is an upswing, you get an incredible burst of criticism of the market, right? They're not working, they're doing everything wrong, it's terrible, but we should get rid of them, you know, all these sorts of things. I think this particular time, the upburst has been just so remarkable in the sense of so many companies and others committing to net zero and realizing that they're not going to get to net zero unless they have some form of offsets. That I think the equal and opposite reaction to it has also been, you know, pretty virulent with, you know, articles in The Guardian, John Oliver. There's a lot of criticism. And, you know, I think some of the criticism is warranted. I'm not sure all of the criticism in that Guardian article was warranted. I think it wasn't. But I think if we go back to basics and we look at the carbon market, at what it's intended to do, it's intended to effectively put a price on an externality, an economic externality that is carbon. And, you know, ideally, maybe we would have governments putting a price on it, and some governments do have regulated carbon markets, and we can talk about those. But realistically, governments are not doing everything they can do to keep us at a reasonable level of climate change. And so the voluntary carbon markets have sort of stepped in. And there's been an evolution since the 90s, since they were created. And we've come up with rules, with standards, with structures. It's way, way better than when it started. When I first started looking at carbon, literally anybody could say, and this was the late 90s, anybody could say, yeah, I got a carbon project, give me credits. We're way beyond that into a much better system. And I think that when people look at the carbon markets, they tend to focus on one aspect of it, one side of the equation. They look at projects themselves, and they look at projects and they say, oh, this project isn't doing this or isn't doing that. And what you have to remember with carbon markets is that there's two sides to these transactions. On the one hand, yes, it's important that projects deliver real carbon benefits. But even if they don't, there is another aspect of carbon that's important, and that is that it's sending that signal to the emitter. If you have to pay, you know, even if it's $2, $4, but it's closer now to $10 or $15 per ton to emit, you think differently about it. And study after study has shown that companies that participate in the voluntary carbon market generally do way more than their peers to limit emissions. And this is the key part, right? We're not going to solve this problem with just offsets. We're going to have to reduce emissions. There's no doubt about that. But companies that are reducing emissions, it should be somewhat of like a hierarchy, right? First, reduce what you can. Then what you can't reduce, you minimize. Then what you can't minimize, that's where you offset, right? And how we follow that hierarchy is important. And that's why we've gotten new approaches to bringing integrity to this market, including the Voluntary Carbon Markets Integrity Initiative, the Integrity Council for the Voluntary Carbon Markets. And I'm perfectly aware that this sounds like a Monty Python skit. Oh, you're the Integrity Council for the Voluntary Carbon Market. I'm the Voluntary Carbon Market Integrity Initiative, right? But the reason for that is that there are these two sides to the carbon market. One is looking at claims. How do companies actually claim emissions reductions? How do they use offsets? And are they claiming after they've done everything they can to reduce their emissions, after they've set up targets, after they've set up plans for meeting those targets? That's integrity on that side of the market. And that's hugely important. We absolutely have to focus on that. The other one is looking at integrity on the other side. How do we know it's a true carbon credit? Sort of the criticism that the Guardian piece or the John Oliver piece have put on these projects. I think we can get beyond these problems. And I think, you know, I think it was a gross misstatement that 90% of carbon projects are fake or problematic. I actually think it's probably closer to the other way around, you know, that 80 to 90% are actually doing real good and having these very important co-benefits to biodiversity, to communities, to water, what have you. So I'd say, I think it is taking us towards where we want to get to. I don't think it's taking us there fast enough because it needs way more than the carbon markets to take us to where we need to be.
Okay, good crash course, right? So a company who wants to enter the marketplace as a buyer, they set a net zero strategy. They do what they can to minimize, change their operations. And at the end, they have some remainder that they want to offset. They go into this marketplace. There are sellers, though, and we've talked maybe a little bit about projects. So Elisa, would you maybe talk about what it is from a project developer standpoint and how this market works from the seller perspective?
Sure. So I will maybe say, I will maybe add to Ricardo's crash course that maybe there is a third sphere or third side of the market, and it is actually something that all this madness and scrutiny and controversy that is going on with Verra, it is partly intended to highlight, and it is the side of the communities and the actual owners of the land where these credits are being generated. So, and now it is part of this co-benefit, so it is not really part of the equation itself, but actually all the safeguards, if you want, of a project should be focused on these communities, on these people that owns the land, that owns the carbon, and who is the first line of fire, if you want, with this project. So I will say that if even in a perfect world where the voluntary carbon markets will work perfectly without any mistake, if the communities, if those landowners, if the producers of those credits are engaged and engage in the equation, engage in the process, and engage not only in the short-term commitment, but remember that we are talking about 20-30 years commitment, 20-30 years project. If they are not convinced that this is something good for them, that this is something that will improve their livelihoods, that will make their lives easier, and their, not only their lives, but also their kids' life more successful, they are not going to be engaged. They are going to sign, they are going to say yes, but next day they are going to change their mind because it is wet paper for them. So I think that to highlight the importance of the market is relevant. To make them as better as possible, it is definitely something that we need to do. But also it is super important, at least from the developer side of things, to engage in the to do it upside down, you see, like to do participatory designs, bottom up designs where their voices, their incentives are taken in account in the long term. Like I have seen so many investors, so many people in the market complaining that a benefit sharing mechanism is not enough because it doesn't reach a certain percentage. Well, I have seen communities that they don't understand percentages, you see? So how can you defend a specific percentage to an investor for a community if the community doesn't even understand a percentage, what that figure is? So it is much more complicated about a quantity. It is much more complicated than a parameter or a KPI. It is a matter of engagement, a matter of sit down with them and eat some tacos and drink some beers and listen to what they have to say, and engage what they have to say in the whole design of the market-based solution. You see.
Great. Okay, Ceci, I want to get you into this next. And so we've talked a little bit about buyers, we talked a little bit about sellers, the marketplace, but there is that little inner piece, that exchange in the middle there. And so from your perspective, and you've worked on standards, I find that to be very interesting. You've worked with Verra, which was the centerpiece of the Guardian article, looking into their practices as a carbon offset registry. But one of the criticisms of standards is that there is no perfect standard. We're not going to get there, but we don't want to let perfect be the enemy of the good here, right? So from your perspective, talk a little bit about standards, how far they've come, and maybe if it was up to Ceci, what are the fundamentals of a good standard for carbon?
Sure. So as Ricardo mentioned, I also think that the market has evolved very much on the standard side. When you look at the methodology that was produced 15 years ago, it's much different than what's produced now. Said that, I think developing a carbon project following one of these methodologies, it's super challenging. There's many steps that need to be followed. It took us 3 years to develop the Mexico Forest Protocol, and it's still not perfect. But I think Verra and the Climate Action Reserve, all of these standards are always trying to evolve and use the best science available at that time. And I think that's one of the big things that the article doesn't mention, right? Like some of these projects that are highly criticized were developed 10 years ago. There wasn't the technology, there wasn't, what we have now. So if you develop a project now, it's much different than what you would developed 10 years ago. It's very challenging to develop a standard and a methodology that fits, the needs of every project, as you might imagine. They can get super complicated and they're not perfect. And I don't think we're ever going to reach perfection because it's nature, right? So and it's people living in this, it's indigenous communities. It's what Elisa just mentioned, right? So developing a perfect carbon project, I don't think we can ever happen. Plus, if you're talking about RED, you're actually trying to predict what's going to happen in the future, right? That's your baseline. So it's never going to be perfect. Now, if you ask me, I think what the standards are missing, and to me, it's a very easy solution to all of these problems, is transparency. If you have a project that's fully transparent on how they're doing their benefit sharing, how they're involving the communities, how they're doing all the calculations, as a buyer, you have the option of, understanding the project in depth and make a decision of whether you want to buy those credits or not. I don't think this was something that was an issue 5 years ago, but I think more and more people are putting more scrutiny on the market, would require that transparency to be out. And I think the standards are working on that as we speak. I think more and more Verra is trying to improve the processes where you can get more information about the projects. Not all projects are the same. As I reviewed tons of projects, you can find the whole range. But I think if it was super transparent and you could see all of it in one place, you could make a decision on whether you want to buy a project or another one. So that, to me, that's the easiest, more convenient and solution to, rather than trying to develop a perfect standard or a perfect methodology.
All right, I want to address the story specifically. And when we had a little pre-conversation last week or a couple of weeks ago, it was impressed upon me to try to focus on all the good things. But I do want to take a moment, that it is literally in the title of this webinar. So I want to take a moment and talk about the article specifically, but I'm going to ask it in this way, and this is open to all three of you. The Verra story in The Guardian and Verra's response, which is something that you guys should read if you haven't yet. What are the kernels of truth in your opinion? It's not completely made up. There's some facts somewhere. So what are the kernels of truth in this, and how does that impact our conversation today?
Well, I can just say something. I think there's a little bit of truth that maybe some of the baselines were inflated, and that's because how the methodology was designed. You can choose the reference region that you use. I think that can be an open for gaming. But like I said, right, who knows, you were predicting the future 10 years ago, and then you're checking it now, right? So there's all ranges of projects, and I think maybe some of them aren't great, and that's what came out in this article, right? But I'll leave it to Ricardo and Elisa.
Yeah, I mean, I would add that the other issue that constantly plagues the carbon markets is this concept of additionality, right? And the idea of additionality is really quite simple. It says, all right, you're offsetting an emission. I'm emitting over here, and I'm offsetting it by making this emission reduction or sequestration or whatever the project is on the other side. If that emission reduction, sequestration, whatever it was, would have happened anyway, then this is a net negative for the climate, right? You're emitting over here, nothing is truly offsetting it. How do we know what would have happened before the project was set up? That's a difficult question. Trying to prove a counterfactual, right? The markets have ways of trying to deal with this, and they have evolved to try and wrap their minds around this concept of additionality. And they kind of break it down into several different levels. One is legal additionality. If you're required to do the project by law, it's not additional, right? You're required to do it. Then you have financial additionality. If it makes financial sense for you to do this project anyway, without the carbon, then it's likely not additional. So, there's other tests, additionality tests out there, but those are the two main ones. But even then, it's a counterfactual. How do you know if it would have been profitable? How do you know if it is? The standards are adapting. So take renewable energy. It used to be you could get credit under Verra for renewable energy projects in some parts of the world. After a while, these renewable energy projects became financially viable without the carbon. So now you can't get carbon for these things. But the question in much of the Guardian articles and much of the criticism around carbon centers around this concept of additionality. And it's saying some of these projects to protect forests would have happened anyway, regardless of whether they got the carbon or not, right? And there's different ways you can manage additionality, like California's carbon market has a completely different way of dealing with additionality. The way they do it is they say, all right, you want to do a forest project? We're going to take a sample of the entire United States, divide it up, and say, here's bioregion, certain bioregions in the US. Each bioregion, we're going to say, has an average amount of carbon per acre in its forests. If you're above that, we're going to give you credit, even though you were already doing it. Why? Because we want to reward the good actors. If you're below that average, i.e. you're below the average for your bioregion, we're not going to give you carbon until you hit that average. It's a very different way of dealing with additionality in the voluntary carbon markets, but there's some sense to it. And so I guess my point is, additionality is such a difficult concept, but it's really about society coming to an agreement and saying, what do we consider additional? And you can come to that agreement in lots of different places that are valid. And any of these places might actually allow something that probably wouldn't be additional to come in, but that's not necessarily killing the system as a whole. So there's a grain of truth in the Guardian article that additionality is difficult. I don't think 90% of the projects were bad in the Verra, red projects are bad. As I said, I think it's probably the other way around. We can try and jiggle this additionality issue and fix it and try and come up with better ways. But at the end of the day, it's always going to be a judgment call and a decision, and judgment calls are open to interpretation and error.
Elisa, anything to add?
Yeah, maybe on a continue with these positive notes, is all the consequences, but all the all the consequences that this article has started. So everything is moving way quicker after this article, and I know that there has been so many different articles in the past. and they are highlighting different aspects of the market, but particularly this paper in the Guardian has put some speed in many mechanisms. I have the feeling like suddenly everything that was dated for years, now it is needed for weeks or months. Investors are now experts in additionality and baseline, and they are ready to scrutinize the design of projects because they have read this article. And this is good. This is bringing it is translating many things to the public, and it is speeding up some processes that need, you see, like an update. So I have the feeling that this type of controversy is bringing air into the system. Or call me naive and positive, but I would like to say that this is good for us to have some pressure on. It is good for the standards because they realize that they need to move on, and it is definitely good for investors because they brings another layer of what, certitude, maybe knowledge.
You know, it's always good when your panel predicts the next pivot question on your crib notes. So Elisa, thank you for that. So I will just level set that and let Ceci and then Ricardo chime in. But my question was going to be, does this, and Ricardo mentioned that this has happened multiple times, but does this spotlight on carbon markets help you in some way to do your work? So Elisa's saying that things are now speeding up, things that maybe were log jammed or getting through faster. People have a more of an awareness of the space. You know, does this help you improve your projects, help you, focus on pieces of the standard that maybe people were just kind of accepting in the past, but now it's open to have that conversation in the present tense, as opposed to, yeah, we'll get to it next time we talk, right? So what are the positives of something like this that come out when you're in the industry and the dust kind of settles from all the uproar of the articles? Ceci, we'll start with you.
Yeah, so I was just going to actually challenge Elisa said, because I think, and then I'll come back to your question because I'm going to start with something else. But I think that all this scrutiny is also putting a lot of pressure on the projects, and just developing a project is already super challenging. And now we're facing, buyers don't anymore want to buy red credits. They all want to buy removal projects, and there's not going to be enough removals for the net zero. And to me, it's a mistake that we're now starting to say, oh, I'm not going to do any conservation projects because of this article, right? Because I think we have to preserve what's already there that has all of these other services like biodiversity and stuff. So I think on the negative side of things, yes, it's putting a lot more pressure on project developers to develop these perfect projects, and buyers are asking all these super in-depth questions, which is good. But then a project, it's facing more costs, it's facing more challenges. On one way, I think it's just making it difficult, more difficult. And the standards are updating their methodologies, but there's a lot of uncertainty of what they're going to look like. And now, because they're trying to make them perfect, it's taking them a long time to get them out. So I think we're living in a time of a lot of uncertainty in the market, and these articles aren't really helping that much. What they do have positive is like, yeah, there's more awareness. People understand the market a little bit better. They know what questions they need to ask. So there are definitely positive things. Verra is now much more aware of what they need to do. They're training their people better. They are like putting more emphasis on the validators and verifiers to do a better job. So I think there's definitely good things, but I think, like somebody said already, we don't want to have a perfect system that actually doesn't work, right?
Yeah, I agree a lot with Ceci here, because I do think there's maybe some silver linings here, which are better attention, things get better, but at some point it could cross this line into, you know, generalized distrust in the entire carbon markets. And, you know, I see that trending up a lot. So, you know, I talk to a lot of young people because I teach at a couple of colleges, and you see this distrust of all things carbon market. And I think this just adds to that distrust of the carbon markets. And for things that I think many of them are not exactly correct. Like, I don't think that Guardian article was properly well fact-checked and researched and done. So yeah, you know, there is some silver lining, but I think this issue that Ceci's pointing to, where buyers are saying, ooh, it's too dangerous to go into some of these red projects, therefore we should do, you know, more carbon removal and direct air carbon sequestration. And look, we need to build these crazy machines that suck carbon out of the atmosphere. And that's where we're going to go. You know, I think, great, we need these machines. So I'm happy that somebody's doing that. But if that comes at the expense of investing in nature-based solutions to climate change, I think that's an utterly huge mistake. And if enough of these articles come out, that's the way it's going to go. That's the way it's going to tilt. And it's important to realize we also have a kind of a new institutional framework emerging, which is these two, you know, supra bodies that are being created, the Voluntary Carbon Markets Integrity Initiative and ICVCM Integrity Council for the Voluntary Carbon Markets, both of which are adding another layer on top of the standards and saying, okay, well, how do we police the police in a way which, you know, in some ways is good, but does add another layer of complexity. And just to add to that layer of complexity, we also have new standards emerging, a lot of new standards emerging, because there's a lot of interest in the carbon markets, a lot of people putting money into them. So, you know, add that to the sort of blockchain crypto explosion, and you get tons of new standards, as well as tons of new markets, as well as people trying to figure out how do you use blockchain and crypto to address the voluntary carbon markets. How do you make them better? We also have seen sort of rating agencies emerge for carbon projects. So third-party rating agencies, which I actually think is a good thing, to say, you know, we're putting our stamp of approval, or we're analyzing this, that, and the other. That's kind of how we do it in financial markets anyway, right? We have credit rating agencies that analyze bond issuances or provide, you know, feedback on bond issuance. So I think that's good, but it's a much more complex system, and it's going to add to cost. It's going to add to slowness in other ways. It's going to scare off some buyers. And if we get to the point where we're throwing out a lot of baby with this bathwater, then I think we're going to have a slowdown, and it's going to impact the ability of these markets to actually do what they I think they are doing.
Good stuff. We have about 9 minutes of Ricardo's time left, and he has to bail because he has to teach that future generation all good things, I'm sure. But we will continue with the rest of the panel after Ricardo has to drop off. But I want to encourage anyone that's joined us, if they have any questions, to please type those in to the comments. Maybe at some point we can pull them up on video if you have your video working. Maybe Gladys can give me a thumbs up or down on that. But please, any questions you have for our panel. I will also reiterate, being able to participate in an affinity group is a great way to get involved in some of this work. You get to hang out with these cool people. One, that's a benefit in and of itself, but two, having the opportunity to have a space to maybe do some cool projects, maybe have some get-togethers around this topic can really be enriching to your work. So please, once again, reach out if you're interested in that. Gladys, any questions? Anybody that is raising their hand from the audience that might want to pop in?
I'm not seeing any yet, but
I see Steph has identified on camera here. Steph, do you have a question for us?
Sure. Thanks. Good to see everyone on the screen, and thanks for the great discussion. A question kind of I've been thinking about. I work in the blue carbon space, similar to Elisa. And Elisa mentioned something, about the role of communities and community livelihoods and benefits sharing. And with the uptick of demand in a lot of these projects, we also see a lot more project developers out there, trying to list projects really quickly, trying to get, consent forms from community members who may or may not know what they're signing on to. And some of these projects often involve, those credits aren't even being owned by the community or the landowners, they're being owned by the project developers. And so my question to this panel is, I think ethically, where should we stand on that? Should the market kind of allow for that kind of immediate transfer of rights ownership from a project developer, since they are the ones coming in and putting up a lot of that upfront cost and everything to get a project off the ground? Or, is it something we should be providing on the market side of things, protection that communities do own the credits that are coming off of the land that they live off of or steward?
Who wants to field that?
I can just comment really on how Verra sees that process. Not that I agree or disagree with it, but they don't put a lot of emphasis on who owns the, they make you sign a document that says that whoever, has the rights to the credits is going to be the project proponent. I do think that there's stuff lacking there, and that there has to be more robustness on this piece of the equation. I did challenge this at Verra at some point, like how can we address it as a standard? And it was an interesting response that I got. It was like, well, the VCS program is focused on carbon. And if you want to do the community, that's why you have CCB, right? And CCB, this is my personal opinion, I think it's a little outdated. They haven't updated it. So definitely there's things that need to be done on that front from a standards perspective. And I think countries are starting to do that as well. At least, for example, countries like Papua New Guinea, in their own regulation, they're being put more scrutiny on who can develop a carbon project, who can be the project owner, what are the safeguards that need to be in place, how's the benefit sharing. So I think we're seeing that in those two different fronts. But yes, we're seeing tons of project developers come in and sign these letters of intent without the landowner. And I think definitely that needs to be addressed.
Elisa?
Sure. Thank you, Steph, for the question. I think that's a super interesting debate. And I think that that's one of the consequences of what we were talking before about all this scrutiny. What is putting pressure is on the small holders, communities, or even startups or small NGOs, people that wants to do some projects, to develop some projects in their own land or in someone else's land, but they don't have the resources enough to actually achieve the level of certitude, rigor, and risk that currently not even the standards, but the investors are requiring. So right now, it is true that if you want to answer all that scrutiny, you need to gather so much information beforehand in order to convince the investor that you are at that level of certitude and rigor. There are other standards like CAR, for example, Climate Action Reserve, that they are intending to engage local communities as developers, to develop the carbon projects into their own lands. And just for that, they are getting a lot of also criticism because they are not rigorous enough. So there is a balance to me, there is a balance in between rigor and size, maybe. And I think that that's not the discussion. The discussion should be focused on ethics and who owns the land and who owns the credits and who should develop the projects.
Great question, Steph. Appreciate that. Cornelia, nice to see you. And then we'll go to JP after that. Cornelia, what do you have?
I just wanted to add or respond, I guess, to Steph's question as well.
Oh, okay.
So those folks who don't know me, my name is Cornelia Renton. I work for a carbon project developer called Upstream Climate Solutions, and we are very concerned when those types of projects come to pass. I think that engaging communities, ensuring that they have ownership of the project is so fundamental to the rigor, quality, and also the long-term success of the project, right? Like if you don't engage properly and have them participate, then if there's a market slowdown or something comes up, they're just like, well, you know, what's the big deal? Like they're not really participating properly, and they don't have ownership of that. They don't have the ability to make that long-term change and see how the project can support their long-term visions for their communities. And I'm always really nervous, and this is in the blue carbon space, in the terrestrial space, when I hear of developers approaching communities and just say, here's upfront cash, we will develop the project, don't worry, we will take on the risk, but we will own all the credits. Because the Indigenous community does not know how big of a pie the pie is that they're talking about, right? Because it's one thing if it's 10,000 credits a year, but it's another thing when they're creating 1 million credits a year. And so I think that having those conversations and making sure that the benefits are shared and distributed and ownership is assigned with nations, Indigenous communities is so incredibly important and vital, and only leads to better projects. Because I do think that you would then end up having a whole bunch of other project challenges if they are not, and you end up in situations where communities are taken advantage of, and they follow on our traditional resource extraction approaches that really we don't think of as examples we want to highlight, right? Like I always kind of think of those traditional mining sections, especially I work a lot in Canada. There are a lot of conversations where mines were developed, upfront money was provided to a community so that they would agree to this development, and this mine resource extraction goes on for years and years, and the company makes millions of dollars, and none of that funding, none of that resource goes back to the community who has, you know, housing issues, they have food issues, they have health concerns. Like none of that money is really being driven back into the community to help support them in their long-term health and long-term vision. So I think those benefit sharings and ensuring that they have ownership and a seat at the discussion for those projects is just so incredibly vital to all those projects.
Great insight. Appreciate that. Ricardo?
Yeah, no, I was just going to say that I agree 100% that communities are absolutely important and that there is this potential that they will be taken advantage of. I think there's a deep question here about the role of intermediaries in this process. And you know, yes, there are good intermediaries and there are bad intermediaries. Sometimes intermediation provides a real service of actually getting capital or expertise or knowledge to the ground. And I think we need to distinguish between good and bad intermediaries. And there's a deeper question that Steph, I think, posed rightfully, which is who should be watching these intermediaries to kind of say, are they doing a good job or a bad job? I think, you know, maybe it should be the Verras of the world. I kind of think that maybe it's time for some of these emerging credit rating agencies or carbon rating agencies that are emerging to step into that breach and sort of say yes or no. They're taking advantage or not taking advantage. I do think you're never going to get away from the fact that NGOs and others on the ground who actually see this and can, you know, blow the whistle need to be involved, because otherwise we won't get that. And we just need to impress upon the buyers that part of the due diligence they have to do is ensuring that communities get a fair share. Now, that's a tricky question too, because what is a fair share? You know, how much risk did the project developer capital come in? How much of a return do they need to actually, you know, pay back that capital and what have you? I think, you know, when we were doing projects, 80–90% of the carbon ended up in the community's hands. And I think, you know, that's probably about right in most cases, but that's probably not even close to the average out there.
And to your point, Elizabeth comments in the comment section, very interesting discussion. Most local communities do so much, but feels like credit goes to the agents. So that was her perspective there. Elisa, you have something to add?
Yeah, maybe a reaction to both Stefan and Cornelia, and an example I usually present is from a carbon project in the south of Mexico. They were for 3 years restoring one patch of mangrove with the community, so everything was super happy. Everyone was engaged, like the whole community was engaged in restoration, you know, carrying little trees around and planting the area. The community was thriving, like the developer was very happy, you know, like counting carbon around. And after the last day of the 3 years of planting, from one day to the other, the whole hectare of planting was burned out. Like the whole thing was burned by the community because, well, I don't have work anymore. Like, what am I going to do? Like, I need to feed my family, right? So if I burn everything down, tomorrow I'm going to start over again for another 3 years of planting little trees, and I'm going to get paid for that. And it is totally logical. Like, I don't know you guys, but to me, my brain, it is absolutely is super logical. So this is the kind of incentives we need to work with. It is their land, so definitely they have the right to burn everything down. They have the right to feed their families, and they need, like, it is on our side as developers to explain how and to make sure that these livelihoods do not only depend on the planting the trees, but on the long term, ensure that those livelihoods are going to be safeguarded.
That's great. That's not great story in terms of the outcome, Lisa, but it's a great illustration of some of these things that we need to think about. JP, let's get to your question.
Thank you, and thanks everyone for sharing their thoughts. I read a recent article. It wasn't a Guardian article, a Bloomberg article, being very critical about probably the largest red project in Africa, if I'm correct, the Kariba project. And one of the points that it was making was about the benefit sharing. So I enjoyed that conversation. But another question I have for the panel is regarding what responsibility the project developer has if they do have knowledge that they're probably being overcredited because of a methodology put in place maybe 10 years ago. In this article, and from conversations I've had with others that knew the project, they said that the project developer probably easily should have known, because everyone else in the area knew that there was being an overcrediting of credits on the project for many years. And instead of selling those credits, they should have held back on the projects, because it's dual responsibility. Yes, you may be afforded a certain number of credits based on methodology, but you should also just have knowledge of where things stand. And so I'm curious people's thoughts on how much responsibility there should be with those involved in the project in just self-policing, I guess, rather than just saying, hey, if we're given the credits, we're gonna make money off them. So I'm curious people's thoughts on that.
Yeah, Jeff, I'm going to jump in because I have to run after this. But you know, I think that yeah, if you are an ethical project developer, you should be doing that, and you should be looking at that. And if you see these discrepancies, you should do that. We can't rely on everybody doing that, because chances are good that they won't. The majority won't actually self-police. So I think there has to probably be some institutional, you know, incentives, let's call them, or disincentives out there to ensure that more is done in that respect. And to say that if this happens, you know, you're going to get dinged, and it's not just the difference that you're going to get dinged, you're going to get dinged more than the difference. And that kind of puts an incentive for you to self-police a little bit more. So, you know, it's the old trust but verify adage. Because I don't think most people will work with within loopholes and try and get the most out of it, at least if they're in it for purely the money and to make a return on the money. You know, money does make people do very odd and unethical things sometimes. So I don't think we can rely on pure ethics. But yes, there is a responsibility, but most people, many project developers won't, as has been, you know, evidenced over the years. So I'd like to see bodies, you know, put a little bit more of a carrot and a stick for people to do more of that.
Thank you, Ricardo. We appreciate the time, and enjoy the rest of your day. Ceci, Elisa, do you have any thoughts on that? Where maybe the responsibility lies, or, you know, when you're in a voluntary market, you know, what are the checks and balances as a certification type, you know, that third-party certifier that Ricardo had mentioned? Does that maybe have a role where you can ding somebody's credibility with a rating if they're taking advantage of situations? Like, what are some of the ideas to try to get at this issue?
So I think from a standards perspective, they are taking up tiny little things on, like they're like shortening the baseline reassessment. So you have to do it more often. So if your baseline was inflated, then it would adjust, you know, not in 10 years, but now in 6 years. I do think that it's the project developer responsibility. I think a challenge is that when you're developing a project, you usually project your emissions and you need it to work for your financial model. And usually the investors also play a role in there, I think. So I think it's responsibility of the project developer, but if you have an investor, I think they should also be okay with, hey, we overestimated it. So you're not going to get your 5 million credits now because we need to adjust. So the investors, I think, and Cornelia or Elisa can probably jump in, but investors usually put a lot of pressure on getting the largest amount of credits and getting payback super quickly. So I think, yes, there's a project developer responsibility and a standards responsibility, but I think it's as a market as a whole, and including investors, they should also be okay with, you know, adjusting if things change.
Lisa, anything to add?
No, just agree with that. But it is, yeah, as a developer, you always feel in a sandwich. You see, like on the one hand is the pressure from the investor, and on the other hand is the pressure from the owners and from the community. Maybe on another note on this is that today there are other tools that we can use in order to bring a bonus for this type of benefit sharing mechanism and co-benefits, like CCB, we were talking about it, or Plan B, for example, put another, like a minimum percentage to the community, and that will help not police, but it will help highlight and get a market benefit from this type of benefits.
Well, Elisa, you just said building a sandwich, and I will say that in the central time zone in the United States, it is lunchtime. And so that is a really nice place for us to maybe close out this webinar. And thank you to our panelists so much. Thank you to the Kinship Foundation for allowing us to have this space. Thank you to Gladys for all of the coordination work that she does, which I am sure is difficult at times, trying to coordinate all of these very opinionated cats that run in all of different directions. But thank you so much, all of you, for joining, and those of you that are watching this later on the website. And let us know what else you would like to hear about, learn from in this type of format, or in any sort of articles or anything like that that we can try to develop and bring to you, the Kinship community. So until next time, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Jeff.
Thank you all.
Everyone. That you guys